Canelo Alvarez joins the Undisputed Club. Let's talk about it. Caleb Plant is a very slick boxer. I'm not going to say he tried to do his best Mayweather impression in there against Canelo, but stylistically, not just him, many other fighters are heavily influenced by Floyd Mayweather. And Caleb Plant has a lot of those moves down pretty well. Moves around the ring very fluidly, uses the shoulder roll to great effect most of the time. In and out movement, strategic clinching. It's not excessive, but it's strategic. And many, if not all, the types of things Mayweather would do. Now, Mayweather was a much sharper puncher than Caleb Plant, and I'm talking about pound for pound. He was more accurate. He would find a way to slot that laser-like right hand through his opponent's defense. He would pick his spots better on the offense. So offensively, he was in a completely different league to Caleb Plant. Defensively, Mayweather was better too, but there isn't as much of a gap in terms of defensive ability with Plant and Mayweather as there is offensive. So Caleb Plant, very slick fighter, was making himself a difficult target for Canelo through most of the bout. I want to say Caleb Plant's best round was the 7th. He actually managed to back Canelo up in that round, or Canelo went back voluntarily. You guys, let me know what you think in the comments. But that was his best round. It was a real good round for him. Canelo looked a little frustrated in that round, actually. But all the way through the bout, Canelo was pursuing Caleb Plant and his momentum was building. Other than that 7th round, his momentum was building throughout, where he was becoming more and more aggressive, landing more and more body shots. And in terms of the way you would score the fight, personally, I didn't score it, but Caleb Plant wasn't landing a lot of clean, effective shots. He was doing a good job of evading what Canelo was doing, at least to the head. Canelo was getting through with nice body shots and really turning his knuckles over. You saw several times when he was sinking those body shots in, he would turn the knuckles over, really dig them into Caleb Plant's ribs. Good technique there from Canelo. And as I say, Canelo was landing a lot of body shots. Caleb Plant wasn't landing much of anything. Some jabs hitting Canelo's gloves. Occasionally he'd get through with a clean jab or a clean right hand to the head, but it wasn't too clean or effective for the most part. Now, Plant was feinting a lot, and for a guy like him, feints are going to be very important, but here's the problem. If we equate a feint to a dog's bark, the effectiveness of the dog's bark in backing whoever the adversary the dog is going up against off is that the adversary believes that the bite is going to be even worse than the bark. So if the bark is bad, wow, I don't want to allow this dog to bite me. Dog starts baring its teeth. That is what sells the bark, is the fear of the bite. But with Caleb Plant, his bark may have seemed decent, right? That feint. But when Canelo felt Caleb Plant's bite, again, this is a metaphor, it might be a bit clunky. When he felt Caleb Plant's bite, he thought, nah, you bite like a poodle, like a chihuahua. I'm not impressed by that bite. And therefore, those feints don't carry much weight, do they? Because if your opponent doesn't fear the real thing, the bite, then why are they going to fear your bark? So Canelo was able to just come straight forward, build more momentum, and walk Caleb Plant down. Plant nearly got there, nearly got to the finish line of the 12th round. Very unlikely that he was ever going to win a decision, because you're really going to have to put some serious damage on Canelo to get a decision. So the likelihood of him doing that, slim to none. But surviving the distance, a moral victory. And look, it's not like he didn't try to win. He did try to win within his particular range of ability. But his range of ability wasn't enough. Canelo hunted him down in that 11th round, eventually got through with some clean headshots. Some of the very few clean headshots Canelo landed in the whole bout. There was a few earlier on in the fight, but for the most part, very few clean head punches landed by either guy, to be fair. But the body shots paid dividends for Canelo, and he lowered the boom in the 11th when Plant was just stationary enough because of the body shots and because of all the movement and the fact it was round 11. Canelo gets through, Plant is hurt, goes down twice, and that's all she wrote. Canelo joins the Undisputed Club. I thought it was a good performance by Canelo, a mature performance against a slippery, awkward, difficult to pin down opponent who was defensively blessed, not offensively blessed, but certainly defensively blessed. And Canelo did a good job. Now, people complain so much about boxing. People who profess to be boxing fans are always talking about how much better UFC is. And look, UFC is great. I massively respect mixed martial arts. I remember when the first UFC ever happened back in the 90s, and they were trashing UFC in the boxing press back then. in KO magazine and Ring magazine. I remember it well. I remember them saying that Frank Bruno, in one of the American publications, it might have been KO magazine, Ring magazine, one of them, and they did some basically hit piece on the first UFC, and they said that even the likes of Frank Bruno would beat these guys. And they made reference to Emmanuel Yarborough, who was an American sumo wrestler, and he got beaten by a guy who was much smaller than him. I think that was in UFC 1. And the reason that it's significant that they said Frank Bruno could beat these guys is because Frank Bruno wasn't highly respected by most of the American boxing press, but they respected the UFC even less. So to see how far the UFC has come, how successful it's been, how many great fighters they have, I mean, I've got nothing but respect for the art form, the sport, whatever you want to call it. Be that as it may, there is some smoke and mirrors with regards to UFC, and I've said this before. They call their champions undisputed champions. Well, in boxing, undisputed is when there's various different belts in a weight division that are recognized as legitimate sanctioning bodies, and then one fighter holds all of them. In UFC, they call you undisputed champion when you've only got one belt. And there's other sanctioning bodies, there's other MMA promotional companies like Bellator, etc. that exist, but you don't have to have their belt. You don't have to be simultaneously the Bellator champion and UFC champion in order for UFC to call you undisputed. You see it? So there's a bit of marketing going on there. And I've had this debate with some people in the comments of previous videos where they say, oh no, but all the best fighters are with UFC. Well, that's your perception. Unless you start having UFC champion versus Bellator champion fights on a regular basis, then you won't really know. Styles make fights, and of course in UFC and mixed martial arts, there's more than one way to skin a cat. You don't just have to win the fight like in boxing on your feet with your fists, but there's takedowns, there's kicks, there's chokeholds, there's submissions, there's all kinds of other stuff involved. So it's a lot more complex. If you had, let's say, 3 or 4 UFC champion versus Bellator champion bouts every year, you trying to tell me that UFC is going to win a clean sweep every year? I find that very difficult to believe. Maybe they'd win the majority, but they wouldn't win all of them. Okay, so to call yourself undisputed when there's only one belt and it's all in-house fights, that's a bit misleading as far as I'm concerned, right? So anyway, UFC within their in-house universe, they do put on consistently good fights. There's no doubt about it. Some of the reservations I have about UFC are the fact that the promotional company, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, is actually a bigger name than any of the fighters. Whereas in boxing, it's the opposite. The fighters, the top draw fighters, the Canelos, etc., are a bigger name than the promotional companies they work with. See, this is the thing I like about it, about boxing, that is. And people talk about boxing never has this and we never get the fights we want and this and that and blah, blah, blah. How many undisputed champions have we had just in the past 5 years? Because it's been several. We've had Terence Crawford, we've had Josh Taylor, we've had Alexander Usyk, and now we've had Canelo Alvarez. This is in the so-called 4-belt era. You can see here on the screen, this DAZN article talks about the 4-belt era, and I'm not sure how they came up with this, but there's a arbitrary date here of 2007 when they say that the 4-belt era began. No idea how they came up with that arbitrary number, or arbitrary date, but it is what it is. Even if you go beyond the 4-belt era, undisputed champions are few and far between. It's not so common. So, certainly in the 3 and 4-belt era. So, to have so many undisputed champions in a relatively short space of time, again, Josh Taylor, Terence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, to have that many undisputed champions in a relatively short space of time is a great achievement for boxing. It's a great look for boxing. And people say, oh, the fighters don't fight each other. You're never going to get every single fight that you want. You're never going to get that. But I do feel as though, in the eyes of some boxing fans, they're unfairly harsh on the sport. They view things as glasses half empty more so than glasses half full. I'm a glasses half full boxing fan. If I was so miserable and so negative about boxing as a lot of these guys are, I wouldn't watch the sport. Why watch a sport that disappoints you so much? What's the point? Go and watch UFC exclusively. if boxing upsets you that much. Yes, we want to see things get better in boxing, but look at the things we already have. You're trying to tell me there ain't great fights in boxing? There's loads of great fights. Undisputed champions, unifications, rivalries, and there's great fights at all levels. Just in the past month, if you try to tell me that you haven't seen some great fights in boxing, then you haven't been watching boxing. Anyway, the point I want to make is salute Canelo Alvarez joining the Undisputed Club. And I'll get on to where he's going to go in a separate video because he's been very active. I mean, talk about a fighter being active at his level. Canelo's fought how many times in the past year? Like 3 or 4 times? Very rare in this day and age to see a fighter of that stature fighting so frequently. So hats off to him, good performance. As far as Caleb Plant, where he goes from here, well, I don't think he did himself a disservice. I think his stock has probably risen a bit after that because there were plenty of people saying that Caleb Plant would get knocked out in, let's say, 6 or 7 rounds. He managed to make it to the 11th. And unlike Billy Joe Saunders, he didn't retire on his stool. So he'll come out of this bout with a certain amount of respect. And he's still a young fighter, I believe, so he can learn from this and he can grow. Canelo has options, and it's going to be a scramble between different networks and promotional companies to get Canelo's signature for his next bout. The Zone are going to be scrambling. I'm sure Showtime, ESPN, Fox, they're all going to be scrambling to get Canelo's signature because you got fighters out there like the Charlos, you got Benavidez, you got ESPN fighters at light heavyweight like Artur Beterbiev, you got the Zone fighters like Dmitry Bivol. These are 175. All very interesting. I personally think that 175 is most interesting because if you're undisputed at 168, what else is there to do? Yeah, there are some money fights and whatever, but you've got all the belts. If you're really looking at legacy, why get bogged down fighting other contenders at 168? Canelo's already a multi-division champion. Let's see if he can go up to 175 and become undisputed there too. He's pushing the envelope now and trying to see how great he can actually be. It's very exciting, actually. Artur Beterbiev is a fighter who a lot of people that I've seen online believe is beatable at this point by Canelo Alvarez. He hasn't been particularly active. His performances have been inconsistent. But what makes it intriguing, at least for me, is the fact that Beterbiev has been a beast for so many years. Not only as a pro, but even as an amateur, this guy was a beast. He was a feared man, a big guy for 175 pounds. Real heavy-handed, good puncher, tremendously strong. I'd just be fascinated to see how Canelo went about the job. Would he try and pressure Artur Beterbiev? Because Canelo these days, as he's moved up in weight and he's at a much greater reach disadvantage, he's primarily a pressure fighter now. Earlier on in Canelo's career, he wasn't primarily a pressure fighter. He actually used to like to box on the back foot a lot more, counterpunch and so on. And he still counterpunches now, of course, but again, it's all primarily front foot, walking opponents down. And he never used to be a very good pressure fighter back in the days, Canelo. That's a skill that he has honed and worked on, and now he is a very good pressure fighter. But back in the days, that wasn't really what came most naturally to Canelo Alvarez. He tended to prefer to move about, walk you onto shots, counter you, and all that kind of thing. So that's testament to how hard Canelo has worked in rounding out his game, improving his skills in every department. But like I say, what strategy would he employ against Beterbiev? Would it all be front foot stuff? Would it be a mixture of front foot, back foot? How would Beterbiev go about it? How would Canelo deal with Beterbiev's strength? How would Beterbiev deal with Canelo's skill and speed? Maybe the strength gap isn't as big as some people would imagine. What if Canelo is just as strong as Beterbiev? I mean, I wouldn't expect that, but you never know. Particularly given the fact that Beterbiev is, in his mid-30s now? And he's a very, very big light heavyweight. The older you get, the more difficult it becomes to make weight usually. And that affects your strength. That affects your stamina. Canelo himself knows that. Anyway, I'll cover that more in a separate video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'm out.